Okay, so today we're going to deep dive into a case that, honestly, it's one of those cases that just makes you wonder about people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like how well you can really know somebody.
Yeah.
We're looking at John Eichinger,
Okay.
convicted of killing 4 people in Pennsylvania. And what we really want to get into is what could have possibly led him down this path, to such horrific acts. We've got some excerpts from his Wikipedia article, and we also pulled some court documents. So let's just kind of see what we can find out together, what we can piece together.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one of the things that's really striking about this case is just the contrast,
Right.
between Eichinger's outward appearance and the horrible things that he did. I mean, he just seemed like an average guy. He grew up in Malvern, Pennsylvania,
Uh-huh.
had a regular job, like as a clerk at Acme.
Oh, wow.
And he was part of this, like, pretty tight group of friends who all loved playing Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah.
So, just like on the surface, you would never, ever suspect anything.
It's really like a Jekyll and Hyde situation,
Totally.
Like, how did this seemingly ordinary guy become a killer? And, I mean, I guess it looks like, from what we've seen, it all kind of started with unrequited love. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, that seems to be like a major factor for sure. He had these romantic feelings for 2 different women in his D&D group, Jennifer Still and Heather Greaves. And, tragically, his like inability to cope with being rejected by them ended up setting off this like whole chain of really awful events.
So, okay, let's go all the way back to the beginning. So the first murder takes place in July of 1999. What happened? What do we know?
Okay, so Eichinger goes to Jennifer Still's house. He's carrying a concealed knife, which, right away, that detail,
Oh, yeah.
suggests he's thinking about this beforehand. Like, it wasn't a spur of the moment kind of thing.
Right.
So he goes there, he confesses how he feels, but still is engaged to someone else.
Okay.
And she rejects him. And I guess just overcome with rage, Eichinger just stabs her over and over and slits her throat.
God, that's just horrible to think about. And then what's even more disturbing is that he tried to cover up what he did by pointing the finger at other people in the D&D group. It's like he was trying to turn their hobby,
Right.
like the thing they all enjoyed together, into some kind of weapon.
Yeah, I mean, you see that a lot, right? It's a pretty common tactic when someone is trying to shift the blame. But what's really messed up is he kept the murder weapon and the clothes he was wearing that day. Like, he held on to these awful, gruesome thing, almost like trophies.
Yeah, that's a detail that really is just creepy. I mean, to me, that says, it wasn't just about getting away with it. There's something else going on, something a lot darker.
Right, you're definitely onto something there. It's what forensic psychologists would call signature behavior.
Okay.
It's like they do things that, go beyond just the crime itself, and it reveals something about what they need psychologically, like their inner workings. So keeping those things, that was like his way of like holding on to the power that he felt when he committed the murder.
So it wasn't enough to actually do it. He needed to like relive it somehow.
Exactly.
Okay, so then what? What happens next?
So for the next 5 years, things seem like pretty quiet from the outside.
Okay.
But every Halloween, he puts on this ghost face mask, from the Scream movies.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And he carries that same murder weapon while he's out trick-or-treating.
Wow, that is so creepy. I mean, it's one thing to keep those things hidden, but to actually, like, make them part of a costume, to bring them out in public like that.
Yeah, it's really unsettling. It tells us, that he doesn't feel bad about what he did, not one bit. And on top of that, there's this really twisted sense of, like, showmanship there. It's almost like he's blurring the lines between what's real and what's fantasy. Like, he's turned his crime into this grotesque performance.
And he did it for 5 years. 5 years he did that. It makes you think, like, was he trying to taunt the police?
Yeah.
Like, daring them to catch him?
Yeah, it's definitely possible. Some criminologists think that some people, especially those with certain personality disorders, they'll subconsciously do things that are risky. Like, it's a way of trying to get attention or maybe even punishment.
Like the self-destructive urge, like they need to get caught.
Yeah.
So 5 years go by with this weird Halloween thing, and then in 2005, things get even worse. He commits another set of murders. What happened?
So on March 25th, 2005, Eichinger delivers flowers to Heather Greaves. Remember, she's the other woman from his D&D group that he had feelings for.
Right.
And guess what? He's carrying that same knife.
Ugh, it's like a pattern, right? A really scary echo of that first murder. The fact that he brought the same weapon he used to kill Jennifer Still, that's got to be significant, don't you think?
Yeah.
It's like it means something to him, like he's making it part of who he is.
Exactly. It just like really emphasizes that signature behavior thing,
Hmm.
and shows that his obsession with violence and control is just growing.
Yeah.
It's like the knife itself became this like symbol of his power,
Huh.
his dark side.
So what happened at her house?
Well, just like with Jennifer, he tells her how he feels and she rejects him.
Well, God.
But this time, the violence is even worse. He fatally stabs Heather, but then he also kills her sister, Lisa. She was only 21.
Oh my God.
And he also kills Heather's little girl, Avery. She was only 3 years old.
Oh God, it's just heartbreaking. And it seems like the violence is escalating, like there's just no regard for human life at all. He went from targeting the women who rejected him to just getting rid of anyone who could be a witness.
Yeah, exactly. It's like this horrifying shift. He's becoming more and more depraved, and he has zero empathy. But this time, there was a witness. A neighbor saw Eichinger covered in blood, which is what led to the investigation.
So how did they finally catch him? How did the police get him?
Well, the murders were so similar, especially with him using the same weapon, that the police went straight to Eichinger. Detective Richard Nilsson, he's the one who interrogated him. At his work, actually.
And did they arrest him right away? Did he confess?
Not right away, no. He said he didn't do it. But then, and this is really strange, Detective Nilsson's gun, it kind of came into view. And Eichinger, he said it was because of some weird company policy about never resisting an armed person. And then he just confessed to all 4 murders.
Wait, so he confessed because of a company policy?
Yeah.
That's bizarre. What does that even mean?
It's hard to say, really. I mean, maybe he saw it as like some kind of authority figure that he just had to obey, or maybe it was some desperate attempt to like feel in control when things were clearly falling apart for him.
That company policy excuse is just so weird. It's such a contradiction. Like, why go through all that trouble to hide the first murder and then just confess like that when they confront him? Maybe there's something more to it, something about his personality that, made him do these things.
You might be right. Maybe we should take a look at the psychological side of things, try to figure out what was going on in his head, see if we can make sense of it all. It is strange, isn't it? That whole confession thing, like almost like he was, I don't know, maybe relieved to finally get caught.
Yeah, maybe all those years hiding behind that ghost face mask were just eating away at him. Like it was all an act, a facade he couldn't keep up anymore.
Could be, could be. I mean, remember, we're talking about a guy who's, well, pretty complex, right? I mean, he hid that first murder, then he does this whole Halloween ritual, then he confesses out of nowhere. There's a lot to unpack there.
So let's talk about the trial. What was the prosecution's angle?
Well, they really focused on the fact that he planned these murders, premeditated. Remember, he said he wore gloves when he killed Jennifer Still, kept the bloody clothes and the knife, like you said before, like trophies. And with the Greaves family, he went there with that same knife. All that points to him thinking it through, planning it out.
Yeah, it's chilling. He didn't just, snap. He went there to kill.
Exactly. And they really emphasized the murders of Lisa and Avery. They argued that he killed them just to get rid of witnesses, just cold-blooded, which made their case for premeditation even stronger.
God, it's just awful. What about the defense? What was their strategy?
Well, they tried to show him as this deeply troubled person. They said he had schizoid personality disorder, which basically means he was detached from relationships and didn't show a lot of emotion.
Yeah.
And on top of that, his father had just died, so they said he was pushed over the edge.
So they were saying he wasn't in control of what he was doing because of his mental state and all the emotional stuff he was going through.
Right, like he wasn't thinking clearly, so he wasn't totally responsible for his actions.
That must have been a hard argument to make, especially with all the evidence of him planning these murders.
Mm-hmm.
Did the jury buy it?
Not really. They did say they thought he had a mental illness, but they said the evidence for premeditation was just too strong and the murders were just so brutal, especially Lisa and Avery. So the jury found him guilty on all 4 counts of capital murder.
Wow. I can only imagine how tense it must have been in the courtroom when they read that verdict.
Oh, it was heavy. You could see the relief on the victims' families' faces, but they were still so sad. It was really hard to watch.
What about Eichinger? How did he react?
He was pretty much emotionless the whole time. During the trial, even when they were sentencing him, there were a few times when maybe you could see a little bit of regret, but mostly he just seemed detached, like he was watching something happen to someone else.
That's so creepy. It's like he couldn't understand what he'd done. Or maybe he just didn't want to.
That's pretty common with schizoid personality disorder, actually. It's hard for them to connect with other people emotionally, so they have trouble understanding how their actions affect others.
That's scary. So they
Yeah.
found him guilty. But what about the sentencing? What happened?
Well, for the murders of Heather, Lisa, and little Avery, Eichinger got 3 death sentences.
Wow.
And for Jennifer Still's murder, he got life in prison.
3 death sentences. That's heavy. Where is he now?
Right now, he's still on death row at the State Correctional Institution Phoenix in Pennsylvania. He's appealed the sentences a bunch of times, but they've all been denied.
What about that death warrant? The one that was signed back in 2008.
Yeah, that's where things get a little complicated. You see, the legal system, especially when you're talking about the death penalty, it's a mess. All these procedures, appeals, it can take years, even decades, before they actually carry out a death sentence.
So he's just stuck waiting, huh? Not knowing if it'll ever actually happen.
Yeah, it's this awful limbo, And it really shows you the ripple effect of what he did, how his actions, they didn't just affect the victims and their families, they affected him too. And they're still affecting him all these years later.
This whole conversation has been really eye-opening. We've learned a lot about Eichinger, what might have motivated him, his psychology, all that. But what about the victims? Can we talk about them for a minute? Who were they?
You're absolutely right. It's so important to remember that these were all people, with lives and dreams, people who loved them. Jennifer Still, she was so young. She was engaged. She was excited about her future. Heather Greaves, she was a mom, a sister. She was really involved in her community. Lisa was going to college. And little Avery, she's just a baby, just starting to experience life. And this guy, he took all that away from them just because he couldn't deal with being rejected.
Yeah, it really hits home. Every time we cover one of these cases, it's just a reminder that behind all the headlines, the court cases, there are real people who have been through something truly horrible.
That's exactly it. We can't forget their stories, and we can't forget the people they left behind, their families, their friends, their communities, the pain they're going through. It's unimaginable.
One of the things that stuck with me throughout this whole deep dive is that Halloween thing, the ghost face mask, the murder weapon. It's just so strange and disturbing.
Yeah, I know what you mean. It gets under your skin. It's like it goes beyond just the murders themselves. There's something even darker there.
Like he was enjoying the horror he created,
Yeah.
Turning it into some kind of sick entertainment.
You're right. It's about more than just the violence. It's about the power he got from it, the control he felt by scaring people. And the ghost face mask, that just adds another layer, right? Like he's mixing up fantasy and reality, which is both fascinating and terrifying at the same time.
And those Scream movies were everywhere back then. Everyone knew that mask. It became like a symbol of fear and violence. Makes you wonder, did those movies, or maybe even that character, have something to do with what he did?
It's a good question, and it's something people study. The connection between what we see in the media and real-life violence. Now, it's impossible to say for sure if those movies had a direct influence on him, but it's definitely a creepy connection, and it makes you think about, do violent movies and TV shows make us less sensitive to violence in real life? And can fictional stories make people act out violently in real life?
Yeah, it makes you think about what we watch and listen to and what messages it might be sending, especially to people who are already vulnerable.
Exactly. We need to be aware of what we're consuming, and we need to talk about how violence in entertainment affects us.
Let's go back to Eichinger's confession for a minute. That company policy thing is just so strange.
Yeah.
It's like he was looking for a reason to give up, like he wanted to get caught.
That's a really interesting point. It doesn't make sense, does it? Why try so hard to get away with it the first time and then just give up like that? Some psychologists think that people, especially if they have personality disorders, they'll subconsciously leave clues or do risky things because they want attention or even punishment.
Like they have this urge to self-destruct, they do terrible things, and then they almost can't help but make sure everyone knows it was them.
It's a really complex thing. It's hard to say for sure what's going on in their minds, but that confession, as weird as it is, it definitely makes this case even more intriguing.
It's wild, right? Like we've been talking about this guy, and the thing that just keeps coming back to me is how normal his life seemed before all this. It's hard to wrap my head around it, Like he's playing D&D with his friends one day, and then he's committing these horrific murders.
It is a pretty stark contrast, isn't it? It really makes you question everything you think you know about, what a killer looks like, how they act. It's a reminder that, evil can hide anywhere, even in the most ordinary places.
It's unsettling, to say the least. Makes you wonder, can you ever really know someone? If a guy like Eichinger can live a double life for so long.
I think it's not so much about being suspicious of everyone around you. It's more about, being aware, being sensitive to those little signs that someone might be struggling. We need to be more empathetic, more aware, Notice when someone's behavior changes or when they're withdrawing from people or if they're expressing a lot of anger, resentment, or like a fascination with violence. Those are all things that we should pay attention to.
So those are like red flags, right? Like
Yeah.
things that might tell us someone's heading down a dangerous path.
I wouldn't say it's about profiling people or jumping to conclusions. It's more about just being a good observer and, being compassionate.
Okay, yeah, that makes
It's
sense.
like if you see something that seems off, you got to say something, Reaching out to someone who might be having a hard time, just listening to them, or even just helping them find resources, it can make all the difference.
It's about building a community, right?
Yeah.
Where people feel safe asking for help and where we all care about each other.
Exactly. And remember, preventing violence, it's not a one-time thing. It takes like a constant effort to educate people, raise awareness, and just create spaces where people can have healthy relationships and learn how to cope with things in a positive way.
So we've been talking about this case for a while now, and honestly, what strikes me is just how complex it is. It's not a story with easy answers, you know?
It really isn't. It makes you think about the darkest parts of human nature, about good and evil, free will. It shows you how hard it is to find justice and to heal after something like this happens.
Yeah, and it reminds you that things aren't always black and white. There are a lot of gray areas, things we might never fully understand.
And that's okay. I mean, accepting that things are complicated, that there are things we don't know, that's part of what makes us human. It's what makes us want to learn, to grow, to find the truth.
After this deep dive, I feel like I have more questions than answers. But I don't think that's a bad thing.
Not at all. Sometimes the questions are the most important part.
Yeah.
The things we don't know, they keep us searching, keep us trying to understand.
So before we wrap up, is there anything you want our listeners to take away from all of this, from John Eichinger's story?
I'd say the most important thing is to never lose hope. Even when you're faced with something truly awful, even when you see just how cruel people can be, we can't give up on hope.
Hope for what? What kind of hope?
Hope for a better world, a world with less violence, a world where people care about mental health. Hope that the victims and their families can find justice, that they can heal.
That's a really beautiful thought. Hope is what keeps us going, what motivates us to make the world a better, kinder place.
Exactly. It's something we have to nurture, something we have to share, and we can never let it go.
That's a great note to end on. Thank you so much for walking us through this. It's been a tough one, but really important.
It was my pleasure. And to all our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Stay curious, stay informed, and stay hopeful.